Hey guys, it's Jim. Thanks for tuning in and coming back. And in today's video, we're going to talk about HDR photography. And specifically, I'm going to share 12 different tips that I use to get the best HDR photos possible. Now, these are just tips that I've learned over the years, either from other people or from doing it myself and experimenting. And they're just things that I use to make sure that I can create the best possible photos. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Now, here I am in my Lightroom library. The first thing I talk about, or tip-wise, is if you look over here on the right-hand side, you can see the file name ends in ARW. I shoot with the Sony camera, this thing here, and that is the RAW file format for Sony's. So tip number one is always shoot in RAW. And that's because they just capture a lot more data, and that's going to give you a lot more leeway when you're editing your photo later. Especially if you're doing quite a bit of stylization to your HDR photos, you have a lot more flexibility without creating artifacts and noise and things like that that could occur if you're just shooting in JPEG. So that's tip number one. Now, tip number two is actually a collection of tips. So I'm just going to group all these together because otherwise it would be a lengthy list. But tip number two involves, number one, shoot in aperture mode. If you've got a dial on top of your camera, I don't know if you can see this or if I'm in the right spot, but anyway, there's an A on it. A stands for aperture, and that's aperture mode. And I always shoot my HDRs in aperture mode. I've seen some people say, oh, I do it in manual and all that, but I gotta admit, I'm not interested in manual at all unless I'm doing a long exposure. That's really the only time I'm shooting manual. Everything else I'm bracketing and I'm shooting in aperture mode, and the reason why is because in aperture mode you select the aperture, but the camera has to figure out how many seconds per exposure. And the truth is, I don't want to figure out how many seconds per exposure. I want to take photos. I don't really care about that stuff because I want to take photos and I don't want to spend my time trying to do math problems or whatever it is. So I shoot in aperture mode. It's never failed me. It works great. And I know a lot of other HDR folks do that as well. So that's probably very, very common knowledge, but I just wanted to talk about that for a second. After that, select your aperture, and I'm sure you know how to do that. I've got a dial here. I just move it with my finger, and I select which aperture I want to get into, and it's going to depend on the scene. If I'm, I don't know, in the old days, let me just tell you this. In the old days, when I first started photography, someone told me, or I read somewhere, hey, if you want everything in focus, then you need to shoot at a really, small aperture like f/22. So I literally took every photo for a year or so at f/22. Every photo, no exaggeration. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really understand, and all I thought was, yeah, I want everything in focus, sure. But you don't have to, do f/22 all the time. I use f/22 if I'm doing some maybe some long exposure work and things like that, but straight up HDRs, this one is f/9, you can see right there. So that's more common for me to kind of be in the f/7 to maybe f/11 range. And so that's first part of tip number two. The other part is after you've checked your or selected your aperture, depending on what you're trying to do, is set your ISO. Again, you've probably got a dial on the back of your I almost said computer, on the back of your, well, it is a computer, I guess, on the back of your camera. Set your ISO, and now I generally try to shoot at ISO 100. You can see that here. And this was even handheld. These photos, for example, were in a train station in London. But I always try to shoot the lowest ISO possible because inherently the whole idea of merging photos and creating HDRs and the tone mapping that occurs sometimes creates noise, so I want to minimize noise in my raw capture as much as possible. So that's why. Then you focus your shot. Make sure your auto bracketing is turned on. Again, it's a setting on the back of my camera. I keep trying to say computer. Anyway, it's a setting on the back of my camera. Every manufacturer probably does it differently. I used to shoot Olympus. They had a dial I could just turn. But in my Sony, I go into a menu, but it's right there at my thumb. It takes me a couple of seconds. And the truth is, if I'm not shooting long exposures, I'm shooting brackets anyway, so I'm always basically in auto exposure bracketing. So it might be called auto bracketing, it might be called bracketing, it might be called auto exposure bracketing or AEB. Whatever it is, look for that. That's a setting you want. Now the other thing is tripod. I've got this handy little travel tripod. It's made by Me Photo. It's blue. I like blue. Blue's a good color. Anyway, I recommend having a tripod if possible, because I like to make sure everything lines up. In the old days, this is going back a few years when I was shooting and editing all my HDRs and Photomatics. If I didn't use a tripod, I sometimes found issues where they didn't line up perfectly, and that just kind of ruins your whole day. I shoot handheld a decent amount, including all these train station shots are handheld. They line up perfectly in Aurora. So I haven't done any comparisons. I can't tell you Aurora is better than Photomatics in that regard. I don't use Photomatics. I only use Aurora because I think it's the best for HDR. But regardless of what you use, I recommend a tripod, and if not, maybe a monopod or set it on something, even a gorilla pod. I've got one of those, and that's handy for setting it on a church pew or tying it, wrapping it around a pole or whatever. So anyway, that's my next tip. The other thing that goes along with a tripod is this handy little device. This is called a cable release. For my camera, it just, dropped that on the desk. It just connects there. I have this on a tripod, and once I'm ready to go, I'll set my focal point in the camera, but then I can focus and fire the brackets. I just push the button down, and it holds it in place, and I'm in good shape. It'll fire the brackets based on that. You can also do this self-timer in a lot of cameras where you can set a 3-second delay. So if you're doing it without a cable release, you can set it up and just get it ready to go, and then you hit the 3-second delay, and that gives you time for your camera to not be shaking from you touching it. The point is, try not to jack with your stuff when it's shooting. You have no idea, in the beginning when I started this, I was all over the place, and my camera didn't even have auto bracketing. And I'm going back 10 years, but it didn't have auto bracketing, so I would literally take an exposure, change the exposure dial, take another one, change it, take it. Half the time things came out horrible and it was a mess. It's way better these days, believe me, but that's a big deal. Now, if you can't get to a tripod, don't have it with you, or you just happen to prefer handheld, there's a number of ways you can get around that. The first thing for me is I try to slow down my breathing if I'm going to shoot handheld, and I want to sort of anchor myself. If I can lean against a wall or squat, tuck my elbows in, and just kind of hold the camera as still as possible, all of that works well. You can also move your ISO up. Now that is going to impact noise, but modern cameras are going to give you a pretty solid ISO range that would still be usable. And of course, there's noise reduction in Aurora anyway, so it's not as big a deal these days, but it's something to think about. And then that's it for tip number 2. That was really a collection of tips around kind of the basic settings. And then you fire your brackets and start taking photos. So now that we've got to that, let's jump into tip number 3, and that is experiment with the number of exposures that you take. If you scroll through Lightroom here, you can see I basically take 3 every time. You'll see dark, medium, light, dark, medium, light, dark, medium, light, that sort of thing. And so if you scroll through, and by the way, yes, I shoot brackets all the time. I don't always create an HDR for my photos, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I always shoot brackets and I always shoot raw files, right? Sometimes I'll take a single exposure like this and just edit that. But the point is, experiment with the number of exposures. For many years, I shot 7 exposures, 1 stop apart. These days, I shoot 3 exposures, 2 stops apart. And the reason why is my camera's a whole lot better than my camera used to be a number of years ago. This Sony in particular has an incredible dynamic range, works just incredibly well and capturing detail and light and all that. And so I don't have to worry most times about needing more than 3 exposures. And in fact, sometimes I only need 1, but I fire brackets anyway because, old habits die hard. The thing about that is certain situations are going to call for more exposures. And so, for example, if you're inside a church, you're going to have a huge disparity between dark and light, where the light coming in the stained glass windows may be really bright, but the interior of the church is going to be dark because of all the stone and concrete. That's a situation where you might want to go to 5 exposures or 7. I've seen people go up to 11 exposures, 1 stop apart. The point is experiment with the number of exposures, and that's tip number 3. Tip number 4, you don't have to center your brackets. And what I mean by that is when I started HDR, everything I read and everybody that I followed was saying, I take 3 or 5 exposures, and in the case of 3, they'll say I'll take a -2, which is a dark one, I'll take a 0, which is a centered exposure, and I'll take a +2, which is a bright one. And so I thought, well, that must be the way to do it. So I take -2, 0, +2. Or if I went broader, like 5 exposures or whatever, I would say maybe, -4, -2, 0, +2, +4. And what I've found over time is that the more plus I had, obviously it gets brighter because you're getting brighter, but I found that many of those frames were completely useless. I had some where I was shooting 7 or 9 exposure brackets, one stop apart, and the +3, +4, +5, whatever it was just literally a solid white frame. I'm not getting anything out of that. It's not really recoverable. It's a complete waste. And so I quit doing that, and I just started experimenting. And what I found is that I prefer to expose to the left. Now that's basically meaning I shoot darker. And so let me give you a couple of examples. Here's one. This one, if you can see, and it's kind of small, but the exposure values for this bracket set are -4, -2, and then 0. So it's 3 exposures, starting -4, pretty dark, -2, and then 0. Here's another one, which is that, come here, hold on, there it is. It's that train station shot. That one's even darker, started -5, then -3, then -1. So my center exposure is a -3 dark exposure. My brightest one is -1. And that's because there was plenty of light available. I didn't probably need to really shoot brackets, but in train stations I always do because there's a fairly good disparity between dark and light. My point is, don't assume that you should center your brackets. I think it's absolutely worthwhile experimenting and deciding, okay, I like to shoot darker or I like to shoot brighter, and experiment with the number of exposures and the things I talked about. The next tip is, let me get some of these photos open, is visualize your results ahead of time while you're in the field, while you're taking the photo. So this is a photo from Canada, and I was there last summer, and it was a sunset. The sun was out of frame to the right. It was really bright in the sky, to be honest, but because it was I'm pointing like it's really going to help. But if you look to the far right, where the sun was setting, it's way behind the hills. And what that means is the entire lake area was pretty dark. That's a situation where it really makes sense to shoot HDR. So I did, right? Because there's a big disparity between dark and light. And I visualized this thinking, all right, I want to accentuate sort of the colors in the sky, the light on the mountains, but I want to bring up those reflections. And so I only needed 3. It was still 3 exposures, but I was able to get what I wanted. And so there are times when you don't need to shoot HDR, like in that train station shot. Let me show you that. That's the final photo I came up with, but I could probably achieve that or something very similar with a single exposure from that bracket set. And I will go back, oops, I missed it. Let me go back to Lightroom and let me show you that bracket set. Here it is, right? So we've got a dark photo, right? That's the HDR base photo. That's the edited. There's your middle exposure, and there's your bright. You can see a little bit of movement there from that one to that one. That's because I was handheld. And I was trying to, do the stuff I mentioned, but hey, I'm not perfect. I'm kind of twitchy, to be honest. So I could probably get my final result with that single middle exposure, which was the -3, if you recall. There's my final result. Okay, tip number 6, have a little bit of self-control. Now this is getting into kind of the artsy thing, and you can absolutely do whatever you want to do. But there's things that come up in HDR processing that can really throw photos off, and that includes an incredible amount of detail, oversaturation to the point of it becoming what I've called before clown vomit, where every color is bright and cheerful and colorful and overdone. There's halos that can come up. So let me go back to this photo. This is a prime example of where you can get halos. When there's a big disparity between light and dark, those edges, you would generally often come up with really intense halos if you're overdoing the contrast and that sort of thing. I think you can manage that really well and create natural looking HDRs really easily in Aurora HDR. And I was able to do that here. It's an HDR. I don't, you might, I don't know. Everybody's eyes are kind of different. I don't see any evidence of halos in this photo, but that's an example of where it can come up. But the point is really that have a little self-control. If you want to go crazy and make an insanely detailed photo, this one's kind of insanely detailed, go for it. Who cares? You should do whatever you want to do. I think that's important. And that's what I did here. I changed the colors. If you remember in Lightroom, it was kind of yellow. There was pink. I did a video about this a few weeks back if you want to see the full editing steps. But I went from that, which is the middle exposure, to that, which is obviously an artistic interpretation. And there's nothing wrong with it. I make no apologies. However, there are going to be a lot of people and that are going to be out there and saying, oh, too much color, too much saturation, too much details, it looks fake, it's clown vomit, it looks overdone, overcooked, too much HDR. And you know what? It doesn't really matter what they say. I'm just saying these are things to be aware of. You should do whatever you want to do. Shadows, I think, are helpful. One of the things when I first got into HDR, let me show you this photo. Every one of my photos looked like this. And what I mean by this is it's fully exposed. Every bit of the photo is visible. There's no shadow. There is some contrast, but there's not any shadow. And so in this photo, you can see all the way down this graffiti tunnel, which is in London. It's just an incredible place. I visit every time I go to London. I go here. It's called Leek or Leaky Street. I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's like a 5-minute walk from the London Eye. Look it up, Leake Street Graffiti Tunnel. Super fun. Anyway, every one of my early HDR photos looked like this because I was all about creating light where none existed and brightening the entire frame. Again, nothing wrong with it. It was a personal preference, but what I found is that I like it better when photos are a little bit more mysterious, when there's some shadow in there, when you do a little bit more management of the light and make it a little bit more realistic. And I'm showing you some examples here where you don't have to brighten every single thing and just make it kind of more realistic. And that's sort of where my tastes go towards at this point in my life. Nothing wrong with making super bright HDRs where all the shadows are lifted and there's light in every bit of the frame. To me, I've gotten to where I like it, have a little bit more of that romantic glow. Even here, there's some shadow I added some vignette, sort of take the viewer's eye away from saying, wow, look at the train station, because if you go back to this photo and if you look at the bright one, I had plenty of light to work with. I could have made this photo completely bright all the way around, but I didn't want to. I like to add a little bit of mystery. I want to leave a little bit to the viewer's imagination, which is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shadows. So that's tip number 7. Having fun? I'm having fun. Okay. Tip number 8, master the software. Aurora is incredible, and I use it to build all my HDR photos. You've got all these different filters here, and you've got a lot of capability like layers, and so you can do all sorts of creative, fun stuff, and you absolutely should do a lot of fun, creative, interesting stuff. The best tip I can say about editing or trying to master the software is just edit and edit and edit. I know it's hard because we have jobs and lives and families and all that, and I get it, but when you have time, dive in and just jack around. Half the time I figure things out either in Aurora or Luminar because I'm curious. And curiosity, I think, is a big deal when it comes to art, right? Get in there and be curious and figure things out. Edit the same photo 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different ways. I did a blog post a couple of years ago where I took the same photo and I showed like 5 or 6 different versions of it that I did in Aurora. And while it's fun to do that and put things like that on the blog and get people interested in things, for me it's an artistic experiment and a creative outlet for figuring out how I can go do other things. It's just, again, it's me being curious, and I think curiosity is a hallmark trait of being an artist and getting into this stuff. And I don't want to get too esoteric here, but that's important. And so edit as much as you can, get crazy, get creative, try stuff, because I think it's a big deal. Consider other software. Now, this is going to sound like sacrilege because I'm talking about HDR, and you know I love Aurora, but consider other tools. Luminar, for example, something I mentioned in a recent video is I now build all my HDR photos in Aurora. I don't use anything else. There are other tools. Lightroom has it. I think Photoshop. I don't ever use Photoshop. HDR Effects Pro has it. On One has an HDR. Let's see. Obviously, I think I said Photomatics, or if I didn't, Photomatics is kind of the old biggie, if you will. But I use Aurora HDR because I think it's the best and I love it. However, there's other filters in Luminar that I can't get in Aurora. So I've adopted Luminar. It's a core component of my workflow for every photo, just about, or let's say 98, 99% of my photos, including my HDRs. I'll build my base HDR here in Aurora, and I'll do some things here where I might bring up HDR enhance, maybe some contrast, maybe some smart tone, and I'm just kind of jacking around. I don't have a plan with this photo. I might do some things like that. I might bring up some HDR structure because that's a really cool kind of grunge look. But then I might say, all right, I'm done. I'll send it back to Lightroom, and then I'll go to Luminar. And so my point is, although Aurora is a completely capable and powerful editor from start to finish for an HDR, and if that's what you want to use and all you want to use, go for it. It's great. You're not going to be unhappy about that. I think it's also important to sort of, take the blinders off sometimes and say, what else can I do? I use Topaz Impression sometimes, and I'll go create photos, but then I'll take them into Topaz Impression and create a painting out of it, simply because I like that artistic look. I'll go to Luminar all the time because it has filters that Aurora doesn't have. My point is just experiment and have fun. And that's really leading me to tip number 10, and that is experiment aggressively. Find your own best methods. These are things I do, but I do a lot of HDRs. I create a lot of videos about things, and I talk about all this stuff, and I'm just going to get another photo on there. And I love to do it, but I don't know everything. I'm learning every week, and I'm trying new stuff, and I'm learning things. So, find your own best methods. Some of these things that I'm talking about are just things I've come across through experimentation and just literally jacking around with it. And so get out there and experiment. Find your own best ways that work for you, because you could ask probably 10 or 20 or 1,000 different photographers their best tips for HDR, and we'd all come up with different stuff. And so your own tips that you find through your own experimentation are equally valuable. So go find them. Don't just blindly follow what other people say. Trust me, I did that a lot in the beginning, and while it was helpful to get me a good basic foundation, I quickly learned that I was only going to really learn when I start doing, because while teachers are important, and I love being a teacher and having people come here and watch my videos and able to share this kind of stuff with people, at the same time, you got to learn on your own. You got to go do it. And so experiment and try things. Okay, that's 10 tips. I got 2 more, and they're quick. Number 11, take a lot of photos. One of my favorite quotes that's been on my blog for years is that your first 10,000 photos are your worst. So take a lot of photos. Now, that is not advice to blindly just run around your house and fire brackets and then delete your card because it fills up with junk and then fire brackets again. I'm talking about deliberately taking photos, not to hit a number. This isn't a quota. You're not in sales. It's not a number or a metric you got to hit at work. This is art, so don't rush through it. Take advantage of your learning process and make a conscious effort to take those 10,000 photos and make them count. It is important, I think. And, I've taken, I don't know how many photos over the years, and I'm sure you've taken a lot too. And I continue to refine my techniques, learn more, change, and do different things as I experiment over time. So, you're never really done, but the point is keep taking, keep experimenting and growing. I think that's important. And you get that experience by taking a lot of photos. And the last tip is please yourself, because it's art. If you're not happy and you're counting on everybody else's feedback to make yourself happy, I think you're doing it wrong. I'm sorry to say. I can't tell you how many times I've posted photos over the years, either on Facebook, Flickr, other places, where people have said, oh my God, why'd you do that? Or that's horrible, or you did this wrong, or you did that wrong. And Does it make me bristle a little bit? Of course. I have an ego just like everybody, and I love for people to say, God, that's gorgeous, Jim. Great job. We're human. Everybody likes positive feedback, and everybody has probably a little bit of a challenge with negative feedback. But here's the thing. Don't listen to those people. If you're doing something that you like and you enjoy it, who gives a shit what somebody else, some random stranger on the internet says? I quit caring years ago, believe me. You can look at my photos today. You can look at this one and say, Jim, way too dramatic. I don't like the colors. It's too contrasty and moody. Jim, I don't like the distribution of light in this photo. It doesn't seem real. Jim, sky's too blue. Jim, that's White Sands, New Mexico. Why is it golden? Jim, that just looks like HDR. I don't really like it. And Jim, like, what are you doing, right? What's going on here? Why is the sky the color it is? Why is it bright here and dark and moody everywhere else? And guess what? You can say all that, and you're totally entitled to your opinion. And I don't care. And I don't mean that crassly or rudely, but like, I don't care. I'm doing what I want to do, and I'm trying to please myself. And if I'm happy with my photo, that's what I'm going for, because it's art. It should be fun, and it should make me happy. And that's my advice for you. Go do what you want to do. Make it fun, make yourself happy, and disregard the people now that are giving you a hard time and being rude about it. If you're getting constructive criticism, there may be some good points there, and I've had plenty of that, and I'll get plenty more in the future. But disregard the haters and the people that are rude, because they're not doing anything for you. This is art. It should be fun, and you should have a good time doing it. And that's my 12 tips for better HDR photos, and really probably better photos in general. I hope you like this kind of video. It's kind of long. I'm sorry. I'm really rambling, but there's a lot to say. And I'll be back with more videos. And if you like this, like it. Please share it with your friends. And thanks for taking the time to watch it. I know it really stretched out, but it's fun stuff to talk about. I hope you enjoyed as much as I do. Hit subscribe, hit like, leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time, my friends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon, and adios.